Good afternoon. My name is Veline L'Esperance. I'm a GP trainee with NIHR funding from King's College London. Today, I will be presenting a cross-sectional study exploring the relationship between general practice funding and practice achievement. In the last decade, funding for general practice has decreased from 11% to 8% of total NHS spending, while GP workload has increased by 19% over the same period. Recent work in Scotland has shown a mismatch between general practice funding and clinical need. Barbara Starfield has demonstrated in international studies that greater investment in primary care is associated with improved population health outcomes. However, there's little evidence that incentive payments themselves result in large improvements in clinical care. Certainly the evidence in favor of QOF as an incentive scheme is mixed. Most funding is through the core GP contract. This is a contract for delivering essential primary care services during core hours. There are mainly two types of contracts, the GMS and PMS contracts. Both pay GP practices according to their number of registered patients, with larger payments for older and sicker patients. However, the PMS contract offers additional payments for delivering locally agreed health targets. Additional income is also available to practices for providing enhanced services such as minor surgery and extended hours, and for achieving clinical targets associated with QOF. This is not quite the whole story. Other factors have to be considered, such as MPIG, which is a top-up tapered payment offered to GMS practices which lost income following the introduction of the new 2004 contract. This chart shows the proportion of funding payments. 53% of practice funding comes from their core contract. As you can see, more practices hold GMS contracts compared to PMS. QOF and enhanced services together account for 21% of practice funding, while 26% of funding comes from other sources, such as premises reimbursements, total dispensing payments, and trainer grants. To date, the impact of the broader aspects of practice funding on performance has not been examined in England. In early 2015, detailed primary care financial data was released by the Department of Health. Using these data, we aim to explore the relationship between payments made to general practices in England and primary care performance. To do this, we constructed linear regression models to explore the predictive power of practice funding on three aspects of secondary care usage: A&E attendances, outpatient attendance, and emergency admissions. We also explored QOF target achievement and patient satisfaction scores, determined by question 28 of the National General Practice Patient Survey. We constructed a separate model for each of these 5 outcomes. We adjusted our model for 18 practice and demographic variables, including deprivation, training practice status, and GP caseload. This slide summarizes the mean funding for essential services in GMS and PMS practices. The total funding mean in 2015 was £141 per patient, but this study focuses on funding for essential services. In both 2014 and 2015, GMS contracts were less well-funded than PMS contracts. Funding increased somewhat in 2015. However, funding varied considerably within each contract, with the top 5% of practices being funded up to twice as much per patient as the least well-funded practices. Today, I will only be focusing on data from the GMS contract because no data is available to describe how additional funding was allocated to locally agreed targets for PMS practices, some of which may have been related to secondary care usage. I will also focus on the 2015 data, since this is more detailed than the 2014 data, which is presented in the conference abstract. I am now going to show you the regression models, focusing on the 2015 data, which includes 4,298 practices. The first column shows the mean values for each of our outcome measures. For example, in 2015, the average GP could expect 325 A&E attendances per 1,000 registered patients and 89 emergency admissions. The B coefficients in our model were only significant in 3 of our outcome measures: A&E attendance, emergency admissions, and patient satisfaction. For example, the B coefficient of minus 1.04 for A&E attendance means that higher GMS funding is associated with lower A&E attendance. There were no significant relationship between GMS funding and outpatient attendance and QOF performance. The R-squared shows the predictive strength of each model. In the next slide, I've tried to translate these B coefficients into what might happen if GMS funding was increased by 10%. Using financial modeling, the B regression coefficient allows us to model the implication of GMS funding changes. For example, a 10% increase in funding would be expected to result in 7.9 fewer A&E attendances. This figure being the product of 7.57 and minus 1.04. Similarly, this is associated with a reduction of 1.8 emergency admissions per 1,000 registered patients per year. We costed these reductions in secondary care activity using reference cost data from the Department of Health. These reductions translate into the following savings of £6,354 for reduced A&E attendances and emergency admissions. We are unable to cost the benefits of increased patient satisfaction. Thus, a 10% increase in funding would cost an additional £7,571, but would be offset by a reduction of £6,354 in A&E attendances and emergency admissions. Our main findings is the association between practice funding and 2 aspects of secondary care usage: A&E attendance and emergency admissions. Our modeling has demonstrated that additional funding in primary care is partially offset in secondary care costs. The lack of association with QOF is hardly surprising, as it has its own funding stream. The lack of association with outpatient attendance was unexpected. However, outpatient attendances were looked at as a whole. We think we may find additional savings through detailed analysis of referrals for specific chronic conditions, such as COPD, diabetes, and asthma. We can only speculate on why better funded practice teams might be able to offer better patient satisfaction. I've summarized on this slide the strengths and limitations of this study. One strength is that this study included the latest funding data. We were also able to replicate our findings in both the 2013-14 and 2014-15 financial years. The limitations of this study include the fact that our health economic assumptions are based on extrapolated data. And of course, these models illustrate an association rather than a causation. And I leave you with this slide in conclusion. Additional funding in primary care is associated with cost savings within the health economy. Thank you.
I'll just stand beside you for 5 minutes and you can take the questions. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Veline. There's 5 minutes for questions for Veline now, please.
Hi, it's Michael Moore. Congratulations, that's a fantastic piece of work, and it's really good to see this. I hope it's going to come out soon. There's another piece of work which I've seen, I can't now reference it, I think it was on a poster suggesting that better funded practices were also more likely to have high quality CQC outputs. So I think that it's making up a picture. Just to point out that the financial inequities are perpetrated further by the local funding distribution. So enhanced services, they use the same model for financial distribution. So if you're, for instance, as a practice taking on doing ECGs, if you're in a better funded practice, you're paid half as much again as the poorly funded practices, even though the piece of work you're doing is roughly the same. So thanks very much for that.
Thank you.
Hello, Simon Griffin from Cambridge. As I understand it, you've done a linear regression, suggesting that for every unit increase in pounds, you're getting those changes you described. But could there be any evidence of a threshold effect? Did you look at other patterns rather than a linear relationship?
Unfortunately, no. We only looked at a linear relationship and didn't look at any other patterns.
Bradley, from Cork in Ireland. Thank you very much again, a wonderful presentation, and from an Irish perspective it's just amazing the data you have and the way you can analyse it and show up things. I just express a little concern from how that data might be interpreted in an Irish context. I think given the difference between the additional cost to primary care and the savings in secondary care, our secondary care colleagues might take two rather adverse interpretations, one of which it's better to put more money into hospital, and secondly, they might also come up with the reductio ad absurdum argument that if you kept putting money into primary care, they will close the hospitals, and that's not going to happen either. So I'm sorry, there could be negative interpretations for by our secondary care colleagues.
Yeah, I mean, it could be interpreted negatively as, it could be said that there's a deficit. However, primary care in England is already overstretched and already underfunded. So we need extra funding anyway. So in addition to giving us that funding to bridge the gap that's already there, you're also getting savings in primary care. So I think it's a win-win situation for everyone.
Okay. Thank you very much, Veline, and I think we should thank her in the usual way again. Thank you.